just yesterday, I think it was yesterday or maybe it was the day before. No, this was Tuesday, just yesterday. Like you mentioned, you had Lauren Ali Khan, preliminary injunction that blocks the administration from freezing federal grants and loans. That was an expansion of an earlier block. Before that, Amir Ali, who you mentioned, ordered the Trump administration to pay foreign aid-related money to government contractors and nonprofit groups by Wednesday night. That's amid the legal fight over freezing of U.S. aid and State Department funds. In that instance, Greg Sargent had a very sort of like just a disturbing story in, I think it was the New Republic, and I'll mention it later in the program, but broadly speaking, there are two companies in this country that create basically an emergency type of food for children who are literally wasting away. These are this is for foreign aid. Children who are so malnourished that they cannot eat regular food because they don't have the capacity to digest it. And it is this like, it's like pre-digested, almost like baby food, but high in protein, made from American-made peanuts, American, all this, American manufactured. The packages say, brought to you by the American public. There's only two companies that do it. They're sitting on enough food to feed like 400,000 children like this, but they don't know who to talk to at USAID. There's nobody to like fulfill the contracts. There's nowhere to go. Does this order like release that money? Do you know? Or and just to add the third one, in Washington State, a federal judge issued an order about halting the suspension of refugee admissions and funding. Do we know, like, are they listening to the courts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult, nuanced area, and there's sort of three answers. The first is, in some cases they are. In some instances, the order is unambiguous. The agency is able to do it. DOJ tells them, and they do it. In some instances, the order, I mean, you understand, like, I mean, if you put two lawyers in a room and show them a contract and tell them to fight about it, they'll find a way to fight about it. And so you have a little bit of that with these TROs and injunctions that, like, it's not surprising that the agency and DOJ are trying to interpret it as narrowly as possible. But then you do have some
now when they do that, when it's narrowly as possible, and I certainly understand the dynamic with lawyers, having been raised by one.
Sorry.
Do the plaintiff attorneys at that time, they go, okay, you guys aren't doing this, we're going back to the court?
Yeah, and that is what has happened in the USAID case. There are two things that can happen. Either the plaintiffs decide that it's not happening, that they feel like it's not being followed, and they go to court, file a motion to enforce the TRO or injunction. Or what has happened, and I think is a good sign, that it's both a sign of sort of aggressive pushback from DOJ, but it's also a sign that it is an acknowledgement of the authority of the court. What they'll do is they'll file a notice of compliance that is, that they'll have language that's like, here is how we interpret your order. Tell us if we're wrong. And It might be an aggressive, like, you and I might look at it and say, like, that's ridiculous. There's no way that the judge's order excluded that. But they're doing it. They're going to court. They're basically putting themselves.
They're de facto conceding that there is authority over them that they feel like they have to justify to.
Exactly. And that's where we're at with Ali right now and this USAID funding, that, like, his initial TRO was February 13th. He issued an order to enforce it that was more generic on February 20th. And then yesterday he issued the order saying, okay, yes, as to the first order, the second order, and now I'm setting a deadline of 11:59 on the 26th.
Okay,
then,
so he's now, okay, let me ask you this, and TRO, just for people, temporary restraining order. And so he's doing, it's like I'm saying, like, hey, to my kid, like, hey, you're done with your iPad right now. You've watched enough screen time. I come back in 2 minutes later, and you're still on it. What are you doing? Put the iPad down. And he's still, I come back 2 minutes later, and I go, okay, you got to count to 10. And if you don't, you'll lose it for the whole week. That's where we are in that. But is there a way for plaintiffs to go in and go like, hey, instead of let's tell the kid 3 times, how about let's start with, you got 3 seconds to put that iPad down, and otherwise we're going to, because
here's the problem, you might lose.
All right, so that's what I was trying to get to.
I mean,
strategically, is there a fear that if we push too hard, we're going to create a precedent where all of a sudden the administration feels like it's off to the races? Now we don't have to listen to anything.
Some of the standards for this preliminary relief, these are technically all emergency relief. And in order to do that, in addition to needing to show that you are likely to succeed in your case, you also need to be able to show what's called irreparable harm. And that's where you get into this issue. And that's where, when you've seen some losses, particularly relating to DOGE aspects, is that the judges are saying you haven't shown irreparable harm. And for some of these funding issues, for some of these removal issues, trying to get a judge to put a direct time limit of like 2 days from now, 24 hours from now, 48 hours from now, what the judge might say is, you can't prove irreparable harm in that time, so I'm denying it. You might be able to prove irreparable harm if
indefinitely
USAID just doesn't fund it, but you can't prove irreparable harm by Wednesday.
If it's not done by within a week. I see. So they don't get that aggressive, because if they make it that narrowly tailored, they have a better chance of losing the temporary restraining order or whatever it is.
So
I
think what we're seeing is in some ways better, because not only is it's the judge getting mad and not the plaintiff getting mad, but it is also setting up, and this is part of the reasoning. Judges, district court judges generally, Kaczmarek notwithstanding, don't want to be reversed on appeal. And part of this is judges being careful to make sure that they are establishing a crystal clear, solid record before they take extreme actions. Like if we do ever get to a point of a federal judge trying to hold a federal executive branch official in contempt, you want to make sure that the judge is able, and the plaintiffs on appeal are able to point to, there is no question that this was intentional non-adherence of a judge's order. We've got 3 weeks of briefing before this judge issued a contempt order. And I think that's what we're seeing is methodical steps being taken to ensure that compliance is clear on the legal front and on the timing front.
All right. So lastly, are you surprised at all by the administration's responses across the board? Like, in other words, their willingness, the compliance thing, the willingness to sort of like not contest. It does not feel, outside of like Musk and Vance at one point, I don't know when this was, like 2 weeks ago maybe, when Vance was like, these judges have no business doing this. Outside of that one moment, did you anticipate a more sort of like legalistic attempt or arguments to be deployed that like, no, this is like, it doesn't feel like there's an attempt to, whereas 2 or 3 weeks ago, it felt like there was going to be an attempt to bring an Impoundment Control Act case to the Supreme Court. It doesn't feel like that anymore. What's your sense?
I think there's two things. I think like on the end front, they still have faith that they've got the Supreme Court in their pocket. And so and when it comes to Trump or Musk lashing out, I bet that there are people behind them behind closed doors being like, if nothing else, calming them down, preventing them from lashing out publicly by saying like, don't worry, these are district court judges. We've at the end of the day, we're going to win. So I do think if we get to the point when like the Supreme Court pushes them down, we're going to have a more make or break moment. The other side of it is that by and large, and this is when we were talking about sort of the steps that Judge Ali is taking, the district court judges have been very careful. They haven't been doing what Kaczmarek does and issuing these overbroad injunctions. When you look at like the order about the DEI funding last Friday, like the judge did such a good job of laying out, I am only going at these 3 provisions in these 2 executive orders. This is all that I'm doing. Here's my legal reasoning under vagueness. Here's my legal reasoning under the First Amendment. And that's why I'm doing that for these 3 discrete provisions of these 2 orders. And what that does is it makes it really hard for Musk, Vance, Trump, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton to start lashing out on social media, because how do you do that when like it's so narrow, so methodical? And so I do think that the judges by and large see what they're up against, and with the exception of like the birthright citizenship order, which luckily thus far we're unanimous across the board in keeping all of that on hold nationwide. The judges are realizing that like they are operating in a moment where they need to be prepared for the administration at any moment to go to the Supreme Court and say, fix this.
Okay, I lied. I had one more question to ask you, and because this one's about Social Security, and I'm very concerned.
Yeah.
They keep saying they're not going to touch Social Security. They have fired people at like, I think 10 different Social Security Administration offices, and you just wrote a piece yesterday.
Yeah, I think you published before midnight.
The entire Office of Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity at Social Security Administration was eliminated. First off, like, I know these guys were obviously a lot of DEI and whatever. No, what does the Office of Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity at Social Security Administration do? And by how many decades did it even predate the concept of DEI?
Yeah, it is the office where responsible for discrimination complaints, for harassment complaints, for accommodations, disability-related accommodations. This is like the internal office that across the nation deals with that, deals with all of those basic protections of the employees across the Social Security Administration. This wasn't brown bag lunches. This wasn't like this was very real harm happening to employees, and this was the office in charge of protecting it. The one thing that I talk about in my article was an employee who, as of Monday, had been a director at that within the office, basically saying that the office had been eliminated, and please wait for instructions from the agency to request EEO counseling, which is how you start a discrimination complaint, report harassment, or guidance for reasonable accommodations. In other
words, if I'm working at a Social Security Administration office in central Massachusetts, and the ramp into the office broke, and my boss there says, "Nah, I'm not going to replace that. We don't need to do that anymore. You got to figure out a way of getting up those stairs." This is the office that I would contact. Yeah. As an employee and say, "Hey, I can't get into my office. Like I have to, go around and, I can't get into my office now." And this is the office that would deal with that complaint. Or if I've got a boss who's going, hey, sweet legs, and I go, "Hey, you're not supposed to be doing that." And this is the office.
That's the office. And the Baltimore Banner got somebody from the Social Security Administration, a spokesperson, to acknowledge that it was 140 employees who were placed on administrative leave immediately within that office. One of the questions that I raised is that the office had several centers within it that it was responsible for. It's not clear if they were a part of these administrative leave. And the problem is that while the acting administrator, the acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration, who himself took office after all sorts of DOGE-related confusion last weekend, if you didn't remember, the Washington Post reported on this, and Marissa Cavas at the Handbasket has also done some follow-up on it, where this guy Leland Dudek, who's now running the administration, he says that they're going to be moving around the statutory responsibilities, which I thought it was interesting. He admitted there are legal responsibilities that were the job of this office, and everybody who was responsible for carrying out those legal obligations was placed on administrative leave yesterday. And while Dudek says that they're going to reallocate responsibilities, he didn't say where they're going. And so, yeah, if something happens this morning to you, it's not clear that the Social Security Administration has anything in place to actually deal with that.
Is he allowed to do that? I mean, how statutorily, like when we have a statute, presumably passed by Congress, that's the way that it's been working in this country for really several hundred years in terms of like statutes. When the statute is passed and says, "Hey, there needs to be a division in Social Security that addresses discriminatory actions and whatnot," like, does he have the ability to sort of change that?
What could happen is that he could issue a memo saying that all of the statutory, it could be a one-sentence memo, all of the statutory obligations of the Office of Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity will forthwith be the responsibility of the Office of Communications.
Okay, I see.
And he could do that.
But for as long as there is no assignment for those, the statute is not being followed.
I would argue that an agency employee would have standing to bring a lawsuit saying that the agency is not
fulfilling
its statutory obligations.
Chris Geidner, proprietor of the Law Dork newsletter on Substack. Really appreciate your time today. There's so much going on, and it's really important that people have at least a clear perspective on at least the sort of the broad categories of what's happening, and you really helped us with that today. Thanks so much. And we'll, of course, put a link to the Law Dork newsletter on Substack.
Thanks.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.